Hi, welcome. Thank you for being here today with us. We're broadcasting live from Park City, Utah, where I am. And Hamlet, you're in South Florida?
I am. Sunny
And
South Florida.
in South Florida. And Ryan, where are you?
I'm in Dallas, Texas.
In Dallas, Texas. So thank you all for being with us today. We are, as usual, in full disclosure, Hamlet and I are friends. Ryan and I just met, but if he's involved with Hamlet, then we're happy to have him. How about that for being clear? Look at John Harrington call. So thank you for spending your time with us today. Hamlet has been kind enough with several of his colleagues in the past to give us what I want to call behind the curtain look of what's really going on in a variety of ways, and in the context of what's happening with Ukraine and Russia and everything that's going on. So this is a timely category to chat about. And without getting too dramatic, it is serious. And so we're super grateful for the insights that you're going to hear today from Ryan and Hamlet. We're going to record this. I think we're going to be able to publish it. I'll leave it up to Hamlet and put it on the Family Office Insights YouTube channel. And then we'll be sure to make sure that everybody on this call will be in touch directly with Hamlet and Ryan, so you don't have to worry about calling us and saying, is it okay, we can call them. We'll just put you in direct contact with them. Full disclosure, again, Hamlet's a friend. I'm also involved in the fund that IronGate, that Hamlet and his colleagues run. So I just want to be clear about that on this broadcast. Super excited to have you guys. Just a little Zoom housekeeping for you all attendees. We can't hear or see you, but we can and will take questions in the chat box. Just please post them as soon as they come to mind, simply because we want to get to as many as possible, and we'll queue them up, and I'll be paying attention to that. You can do it either in the chat box or the Q&A. So with that, Hamlet, take it away. Thanks so much for being here.
Great, no, I appreciate it. Ryan, you want to start off with a quick intro, and I'll kick us off from a macro level, and then we'll get into the macroeconomic piece.
I'm Ryan Morfin. I'm one of the partners at IronGate. I'm also CEO of Wentworth Management Services, but there's really nothing more important that I do than assist the mission of IronGate, which is to strengthen our national security. In today's environment, we're seeing the fruits of globalization play out. And I'd just like to quote somebody that said, the first to expose the fact that global growth might not produce harmony and convergence, but conflict and contradiction, was Vladimir Putin in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference. And it strikes me that globalization has fueled state capitalism in a way that has allowed them to prepare for coming economic conflict in the 21st century. And so there's a lot of things going on here. I don't think you can understand the war in Ukraine without understanding the war and the economic war that the West has waged against Russia with their sanctions. But these economic issues and military and intelligence issues are all tied together. And so I'm here today to talk a little bit about the economic warfare that's going on, and talk a little bit about what's been going on to the two local economies, Russia and Ukraine, and what might spill over into the global economy. And so that's one facet of what we'll talk about today. Hamlet, I'll kick it back to you.
Cool. Thanks, Ryan. And Arthur, again, thanks again for your friendship and help here. And I want to thank everyone who's attending this webinar, and as well as the folks who are going to listen to this as we publish it. But this is a pretty important topic. My name is Hamlet Yousef. I'm one of the partners at IronGate Capital Advisors. For those of you who are not familiar with us, we're a venture investment platform that allows family offices access to investing in early stage technologies that have a direct application in national security and defense. Our thesis was predicated on the fact that we're going down the path of a second Cold War, if not a third World War, where asymmetric warfare and the deployment of technology is going to be a game changer. Unfortunately, what we're starting to see right now with the Ukraine crisis is a lot of that technology and a lot of those issues kind of laid to bear. Everyone said that 9/11 changed the world. I disagree. I think 9/11 kind of turned the lights on and made us realize how bad the neighborhood was. Same thing here with what's happening in the Ukraine crisis. I think it's making a lot of people have pause and take assessment of what the world looks like and how do we get past this and through this. I'll give you guys a general kind of overview as how we are seeing the things play out in Ukraine from a macro standpoint, and then from there transition into what is that impact on the family office space, allocators, and how do you position yourself to basically get ready to deal with what's coming ahead. As you guys know, with our fund, most of the folks associated with our fund come from the national security defense ecosystem. The general brief I'm about to give is a mix of my informed opinion and some of the things we're seeing coming out of DC and Europe. This is by far not government positioning or anything like that, but what you're seeing happen in Ukraine right now, my personal opinion, is the opening act of 3 acts. You have Russia basically taking action to grab as much turf as Putin can get inside Ukraine. Going back to Ryan's comments, this isn't anything new. Putin's been telling us this is what he wants to do since he came to power. We, for the most part, have ignored this. We've been paying attention to conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq, and we haven't really paid attention to what our near peer adversaries are doing, in this case, China and Russia. So Act 1 is Ukraine. It's Putin assessing weakness or lack of resolve in global governance and trying to basically build a buffer to the West. The Russian psyche has been invaded multiple times by various different forces throughout Europe. So they want to have a buffer of states around them. So I think people have heard this narrative. We obviously are very much in agreement of that. What you're seeing happen more tactically inside Ukraine right now is unfortunately is going to lead to more escalation. Because if you believe that Russia and Putin is at the end of his rope and things aren't going to plan as planned, and he needs to negotiate, he needs to grab as much turf and chips on the table as possible right now. So if he is forced to negotiate, he's got more to give back, and he ends up with what he wants, which is that land bridge from Russia down to Crimea and the southern part of Ukraine, and then use that as a buffer, then potentially as a base of operations to further destabilize Eastern Europe and try to reconstitute the western flank of the Soviet Empire. So that means more escalation. You're starting to see it in Mariupol. You're starting to see it around Kyiv, where you see the encirclement of these cities. Unfortunately, this textbook or this playbook has been played out in the past by Putin in Chechnya and in Syria. So this is where you're starting to see a significant spike in potential civilian casualties. Unfortunately, we're starting to see images of that already come out. People have talked about what happens with chem, bio, and nuclear. Is that something that's on the table? To be bluntly, yes, because they're a nuclear power and they have access to biological and chemical weapons, and they've used biochem in Syria in the past. So is that a real threat? Yes, with the probability. At that point, that's where the armchair quarterbacking comes in. But you got to assume that threat is real and that's out there. So how do you deal and mitigate with that? Act 2 and Act 3 behind this geopolitically, I think. So the Act 1 is Russia's power grab or land grab around Ukraine. And all these things are interrelated. The second act of the strategy that we're facing right now, I think, is the Iran nuclear deal, the JPOA nuclear deal. So Iran wants access to technology and resources to allow them to become a nuclear state under the guise of scientific research and not for nuclear weapons. So there's been a back and forth negotiations around that in a strange world that nobody could have imagined until 2022. You have the West on one side of the negotiating table, you have Iran at the other side of the negotiating table, and you have Russia right now trying to play the intermediary in that deal, which is oddly strange. And conversely, you have the Ukraine and you have the Russia conflict with Israel and Turkey potentially playing intermediaries there. So if there is a nuclear deal or an agreement with with Iran, that potentially sets forth a whole host of dominoes that fall as it relates to what kind of action and position does the House of Saud, the Emiratis, and the Israelis take if Iran does get the nuclear deal, and they have an assessment that could potentially lead them to being a nuclear state in short order. So that lights a match in a part of the world that is already pretty ripe and does not need any extra accelerants. The third act, which is the interesting part, is Xi and what he is trying to assess. And I frankly think he kind of nudged Putin to go first for his land grab, because he wanted to assess and understand what the global resolve looked like around taking action against the totalitarian land grab of Ukraine. Because in his mind, if he does want to grab Taiwan, which has long been in the news, and Nepal, which people have not talked about, and some of the water rights around what comes off the Himalayas, he wants to know exactly what he's getting into. So I think they're taking copious notes to see what the global reaction looks like, and how do you react to them? How do you plan accordingly? So that's what we're looking at from a macro standpoint. The landscape has changed. The global war on terror and terrorism is an issue that is going to be with us for the foreseeable future. But the existential threat that I think the world is dealing with right now is this great power competition, this near peer competition that has very quickly gone from being a competition to a conflict. Cold War 2.0, I think, is starting to manifest itself. Some will argue, as I will, that this Cold War started a couple of years ago. We're just now waking up and realizing that war is being waged. What's going to define what this plays out, or how this plays out, I think, is going to be almost a resurgence of MAD, mutual degree destruction. For those of you who are child of the 80s and prior, that was the concept where us and the Soviets never got into a kinetic nuclear war against each other, because when we looked across the table, we realized that each of us had capabilities to wipe out the other. So we never went down that path. What you're starting to see happen now, I think, is a same kind of MAD, but the MAD that drove the 20th century was primarily nuclear. What happens if we launch a nuclear war? Let's not do that. What you're starting to see happen, I think, here in the 21st century is, because of the explosion of disruptive technologies and quantum computing, hypersonics, cybersecurity, AI, autonomous, there's a technology arms race that's happening right now where both sides, or all sides, are getting armed up to a certain point that we're going to have to reassess how we deal and manage with conflict, and how do we resolve conflict without getting into a kinetic war. Because if you look at cyber warfare, if you look at economic warfare, if you look at autonomous systems and robotics, and them being critical parts of warfare, all warfare or all conflict has the potential to go down to full-scale war. What you want to do is you want to avoid that. You want to avoid that at all costs. Part of it is peace through strength, and part of it is through having a sounder, more robust and healthy economy to help avert that, or help fuel victory if it absolutely goes down to that path. So we're going to make a quick switch here. I want to have Ryan talk about Ukraine and talk about some of the macroeconomic themes. And then from there, we're going to talk about some of the technologies that we think are reshaping the battlefield, so to speak. But more importantly, what this means from an opportunity standpoint for investors, allocators, and people who are trying to reposition their portfolio going into the back half of this decade and the rest of the 21st century. Ryan?
Thanks, Hamlet. Well, so I think it's very important to just put some context around what we're dealing with here from a macroeconomic perspective. You had the USSR embarrassed in the 1990s. Putin really never got over that. So he took an economy from crony capitalism to state capitalism with the oligarch model, where they became a major exporting economy. And so exports, whether they'd like it or not, are very critical to the future growth of Russia and to the financial health of the oligarchs, which will create a circle of pressure around Putin for some of his decisions. The bond market loved Russian debt over the last 10 years. The fiscal conservatism of the Russian central bank, they started to pay off all their IMF debt. They raised about $630 billion of reserve currency in foreign banks, which was a big mistake. And then they also underwrote their budget at $45 oil. And so if you look at a lot of the other OPEC members, they're above that. They're at $60 to $65 plus. So it was a prudent state run by an authoritarian regime that was implementing state export capitalism. And really the rise of China has financed the rebuilding of Russia's military might. And so if you look at that from a background standpoint, Ukraine represents a model, a buffer zone model, an economic model that could be more tied to a liberalized economy, with the EU and the Poland model being successful. And Russia does not want to have that on its doorstep. Similar to Taiwan being a democracy that flourishes, South Korea next to China, those are very dangerous peers to be bordering totalitarian regime. So I think there's the political and there's an economic case for why Putin doesn't want Ukraine to be successful. Hamlet, if you don't mind pulling up the slides here. So I think it's important to see what this really is about, and from an economic dollar and cent standpoint, because there is a budget to this war. There has to be. There is probably a fail-safe of where this no longer makes economic sense, and then it becomes a political reality only. And if you look at the population of Russia, it's frankly about 3.5 times the size of Ukraine. The central bank reserves is going to come into play here. Pre-conflict, Russia was actually an investment grade economy, so it enjoyed low cost of debt. But they put their central bank reserves over into Europe and in other parts of the world in the Middle East. 2/3 of those reserves were actually G10 currencies, US dollar, euro. The other 1/3 was Chinese yuan and gold. And so 2/3 of their assets have been seized. And the Ukrainian central bank has been utilizing their bank relationships to pay for arms deals to come in to support the Ukrainian military defense. So again, the 11th largest economy is attacking the 57th largest economy. And again, major exports of that 1.7 trillion economy, over 400 billion are exports. So the West looks at that as an Achilles heel. The IMF has just come out and said that there should be a negative 9 to 10% GDP drop in Russia this year, but that pales into comparison what is going to happen into the GDP growth rate of Ukraine, which will be probably about negative 35 to 40%. And so, Hamlet, if you don't mind going to the next slide. So you can see that stocks have dropped in Russia, as you would expect, with the sanctions coming into play. But what's interesting to see is a very correlated drop in government bond yields for the UK, the US, Germany. And so there's a flight to safety, and it's causing an interesting dynamic today from a family office perspective of what it's going to do to central bankers and their view on increasing interest rates. I still think there'll be a rate hike today because of inflation in the US, but there's a tale of two cities with central banks today. The countries that are going to be the recipients of the capital flowing to safety are going to see credit spreads stay compact. And we think the governments there will be able to start increasing the risk-free rate at the government issuance because inflation is out of control today globally. And so that's a very important point, because we're entering into some sectors of the world, namely the European Union, where stagflation is going to accelerate faster in the EU than it will in the US. That's going to limit the options that the central bankers have to limit quantitative easing and to start raising rates, which we desperately need to keep inflation intact. So going back to the size and the scale of the Russian economy and the Ukrainian economy, it's like an infection in the body. The countries that are bordering and that are trading partners with Russia, so like Turkey, Eastern Europe, China, they're going to have commodity deficits, trading deficits. They're going to have impacts to their supply chains. And so Europe is going to have a drag on its growth, but countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Colombia, the US, because we're further away and have less connectivity into Russia, we will not see that much of an impact. So we think, this 2% of global GDP on a market basis is what Russia represents, isn't enough to infect growth or the outlook around the rest of the world. It will create some very interesting capital markets uncertainty that I'll talk about in a minute with the Russian bond market. You can see that, the interest rates in Russia went from 9% to 20% in the course of a few weeks once the sanctions hit. There's a bond default looming. I think by March 27th, if they don't figure out how to make their US dollar payment, they will default. A lot of foreign owners of those bonds have credit default swaps, but that will put some pricing pressure in the CDS market as it ripples through the capital markets, as insurers have to start paying those defaults. So in the short and medium term, you're going to see the credit markets spasm a little bit. There's also about 100 billion of Russian-owned hedge fund assets in the United States, and it's not clear what the U.S. Treasury wants hedge funds to do in terms of redemption or seizing of those assets. So there may be a run on liquidity for the U.S. hedge fund market in the coming weeks, depending on Treasury policy and also EU policy. As it relates to Russia being an export market, if you go to the next page, Hamlet, the Russian economy is heavily focused on energy, on metals, and on food, and so is the Ukrainian. And so as you see the interest rates spiking, you're also seeing the inflation of local prices for wheat, for corn, for nickel. You're seeing the U.S. dollar ruble exchange rate spike. And so these pressures are really going to put a financial squeeze, not only on the 80% of the Russian bank market, but on all foreign trading partners, multinationals that exist in Russia. Some of the capital controls that have been put in place by the Russian central bank are, they're forcing foreign companies to sell 80% of their non-ruble FX. They're not allowing foreign investors to sell assets and repatriate, and local investors are not allowed to take rubles out of the country. And so as you see this 40 to 50% devaluation of the ruble, it's going to make it a lot more expensive for Russia to finance this war. You have Zelensky using very smart politics, offering, bonuses, signing bonuses for people to get a peace dividend to walk away from the war, when the same soldier is looking back and realizing he's getting paid, I think it's like something like $1,500 a month, 1,500 rubles a month, but that's getting degraded in terms of purchasing power. And so economics is not lost on the people on the front lines. And so I think these types of strategies actually create a psyche of weakness for the Russians, because they know that the home economy is not on good footing. As it relates to the SWIFT sanctions, I don't believe the Russians or the Chinese realized that the West would go ahead and start to push them out of the SWIFT system. And what I think that does is it freezes obviously the currency reserves of the central bank, but what it does is it starts to put some mental pressure on the idea of foreign economies such as Saudi Arabia not using the US dollar as the denominated currency for oil trades between, say, Saudi Arabia and China. And so that's a very important point, because if we lose reserve currency status and bad actors believe that they can't trust the US dollar to settle trade terms, there will be a greater push towards the digital yuan or the digital currencies from other state central banks. And so we need to be careful of the West. If we didn't have holistic support of Europe behind us, we wouldn't have been able to do that. And it is also the Europeans who were the ones that forced us to accept an energy carve out on the sanctions. Had we been able to put the energy market on ice for Putin, this thing would have probably come to a crashing halt. But the problem is 60% of Germany's gas, which is critical for consumer household, is tied to Russian exports. And so the Germans forced the Biden administration not to include that. Biden came out swinging and said that. And so as it relates to kind of where I see things going, if you go to the next slide, Hamlet, it's all about, real estate. And so, people like seeing, prognoses of where we think things are going to end up. I drew a map across Ukraine. If you look, most of the means of production are in the east. Those were industrialized cities from the USSR. With the exception of Kiev, I think that most of the cities on the east will get annexed into Russia in some type of peace settlement. But that's also where all the economic capacity and production, means of production, are for the most part. There's 5 nuclear power plants in Ukraine. I believe you'll see the Russian military go in and extract a lot of the uranium out of the 2 in the west and move it all over to the east. And so from my perspective, they got the seaports, they've got all the manufacturing capacity, and about 1/3 of the agricultural capacity in the country. If you have an East Ukraine and a West Ukraine, you've created a buffer state between NATO and Russia, and you've just paid for your war. I think the multiple on invested capital, if you will, is about a 3 or 4x for Russia if they're able to grab these assets, if you look at it from an economic perspective. And so with that, I can go in on the Q&A component into more detail about any of these issues, but these are some of the thoughts from an economic warfare standpoint that I'm thinking about.
So Ryan, if you could you put that map back up, Hamlet? Is your assessment of the idea that I'm going to go for the whole thing and I'm only going to get the pieces that I really want, and that's where the economic value is
Yep.
that opinion something that's an opinion of those in the know like you, or is this unique to you?
I think there's military planners, there's economic warfare, soft power folks, and then there's what I'll call the diplomats. If you're looking at it from an economic warfare standpoint, we used to have a Department of Economic Warfare in the State Department and in the military in World War II, and we wound it down, and we moved a lot of that infrastructure into USAID and State Department, and that's part of the infrastructure that helped us win the Cold War. Back in the 20th century. We've let that atrophy as we've gone after, what I'll call less than peer adversaries in the Middle East and Afghanistan. And so, but the Russians never did. And so the Russians and the Chinese are, and frankly, more advanced at statecraft than we are. And so when they go in and do something, whether it's the Chinese and the Belt and Road Initiative, or the Russians repairing their balance sheet and creating this huge buffer of foreign currency reserves, they're thinking about how do they decouple, if you will, the weaponized interconnectivity of globalization. So this is very much on the top of the mind for Putin and Xi. And as Hamlet said earlier, economic considerations are top of mind when they're planning military operations. And unfortunately for you that we're moving back into this Cold War, we've been talking about it for a while, but what I would tell you, it's going to be kind of two spheres of influence. It's going to be the West, liberal democracies, and it's going to be authoritarian regimes as a trading bloc between China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, et cetera. So I think we're starting to see the decoupling of globalization and the reigniting of new accesses around the world from an economic perspective.
It seems like a pretty pedestrian gambit, but obviously very complex in that on negotiation, I'm going to go for the whole thing, and then I'm going to settle with what I really want.
Yep.
I don't mean to oversimplify it, but that's what it looks like, right?
That's exactly what we're looking at. So when I said Putin's going to try to grab as many chips on the table, he wants this entire map. That's what he wants. He's more than happy to settle with what we may end up giving him, which is the eastern provinces, potentially all the way up to the river and the map that Ryan has drawn out here. If the world gives me the Ukraine, great, I'll take it, I'll figure it out. If not, then I'll get what I need, which is where all the production is. I now have a land bridge down to Crimea. I now have warm water access through the Black Sea. I may now lean on Turkey to give me access to the Straits with that issue. And I have a nice little buffer between me and NATO. And I can now use this buffer as a base of operations to further destabilize and plan my follow-on sequels to this horror show of exerting influence through the rest of Eastern Europe and Europe proper. This is a long game. This isn't an election cycle plan for Putin. I think this is something he's been planning for the better part of his career. I mean, everyone kind of was pleasantly surprised when he first came to power. You have this little bureaucrat taking over for Yeltsin, who had his own issues, and he seemed like a good ally in the global war on terror. Well, we didn't pay attention, but this guy had been basically laying the foundation for this kind of an operation or attack against us for a better part of his career. And not to get too conspiratorial, but there's no coincidences in foreign policy and geopolitics. The fact that this happened right after the Beijing Olympics, it happened right after that show of force and cooperation between Xi and Putin, their photo op around the Olympics, in a run-up to our midterm elections, in the run-up to the Chinese Congress that's coming up in October. This is, to me, looks like a coordinated effort, but specific to Ukraine, it's exactly it, Arthur. It's let me grab as much turf as I can. What I want is the land bridge. What I want is the East. I'll take the whole country if they're willing to give it to me. But this is going to be my fallback position. And to be able to negotiate from a position of leverage is why I think, and so many people think, that we are looking in the short term some significant violent escalation in Ukraine, because he's got to make it so violent, so horrible, so horrific to either break the will of the people inside Ukraine and or force us in the West to some sort of a negotiating position to give him his concessions and what he wants.
Is there a comment that you can make to the extent you've been able to process the seemingly when you said that Zelensky's doing smart things, he just went on public to the Congress this morning, right?
Yeah,
And
powerful message.
And that message, not only the message, but that he actually did is reminiscent of 9/11 and all that business.
Yeah.
What do you guys think about all that?
Look, this kind of gets into some of the soft power of what you're seeing happen in and around Ukraine. For being a grand strategist, which is Putin, the information war or the propaganda war is something where the Ukrainians are doing a masterful job right now. It looks like you have these images of Putin having meetings with his two command generals, and they're sitting on the far end of a 20-foot table.
What's that all about? Is he like?
It looks like a clown show. But in the meantime, you have Zelensky sitting here in the Capitol saying, "Hey, man, here I am. Come get me." He's in the foxholes. He's in the trenches. He's with the people. Very Churchillian. So the images there are pretty stark. The fact that you're starting to see all these POW videos come out of these officers and these conscripts who didn't know what they were doing and are being apologetic because they were basically commanded to do their act. That's pretty striking. The fact that that they're saying, "Hey, the money that the Soviets or the Russians are paying you is worthless. Your currency's collapsing. Here's $1,000. Lay down your arms." I mean, those are powerful messages. If that's what's happening at scale, is great. But if not, that image and that kind of propaganda and that kind of information or disinformation is striking. And this is where I think where this Ukraine crisis is a very kinetic conflict. It's a traditional war, but you're starting to see so many other elements of modern warfare, 21st century warfare play into it. Information and disinformation is a big part of it. Purely my speculation here, but when this thing first kickstarted, everyone said, "Hey, buckle up. You're going to have cyber warfare. You're going to have massive attacks on critical infrastructure and grids and whatnot." That's a real threat. The Russians are very capable of large scale, debilitating cyber attacks. We've seen solar winds. We've seen a variety of attacks against the West that have been linked to the Russians. That threat is 100% on the table. There's some, and I'm part of this camp, think one of the reasons we haven't seen large scale asymmetric cyber warfare launched against the private sector in the West and the US or Europe are two things. One, the NATO came out last week and said, we're going to consider large scale cyber attacks on infrastructure as a potential possible initiation of Article 5 of NATO. So they're putting that out there. The second part of it is it comes down to resources. The Ukrainians and Anonymous have basically waged their own cyber war back against Russia, and they're attacking their infrastructure. So if you got a bunch of hackers and their entire day and night is spent deflecting and defending against inbound attacks against their infrastructure, you got no time to fight back. So that could be what you're seeing here. So you have the manifestation of cyber warfare and tech warfare playing out here in front of us. You have disinformation and information warfare playing out in front of us. The other thing you're starting to see is this is going to be the OSINT war. This is going to be the space war. OSINT is open source intelligence. You have space and satellite constellation companies that are putting imagery out there to allow people to see where these columns of tanks and movements are inside the Soviet or inside Ukraine. So you see where the Russians are acting and moving. So although you can probably get a little bit critical in terms of how quickly the governments are moving to help support the Ukrainian war effort, what you've seen is a tremendous amount of support from the private sector, from the banking sector, and from the economic community to wage this war. The other part of it, from a technological standpoint, Putin has spent millions and billions of dollars on building up his conventional warfare or conventional capabilities, but you have a multi-million-dollar piece of tank equipment being taken down by a drone with a couple $100 worth of Semtex and gear on it, and it's dive bombing into complex Russian hardware. You had, I think, right when the Russians came and crossed the border, one of the calls that went after the Ukrainian government is, "Hey, all you guys out there with consumer drones, get your assets up in the air. We want to see what these guys are doing." So it's a fascinating space to watch. And this kind of ties into what we talked about earlier, is what does this mean from a microeconomic standpoint? Ryan touched on this decoupling of globalization. What you're starting to see, I think, is a rising need to continue to fuel the growth of something that started under Obama. It was accelerated under Biden, accelerated under President Trump, and not reversed under President Biden. And that is this shifting of DoD spending and focus and engagement with the private sector to bring in disruptive technologies and innovation into the war, or national security effort. And these are technologies that could have a larger scale commercial private sector application, but in the hands of the right person, have a massive impact in national security and defense. In terms of where we're at right now from a GDP standpoint, from an inflationary standpoint, from an economic standpoint, we got some rough waters ahead of us. But if you truly believe that there's going to be some significant disruptions coming, not only to this conflict, but the overall geopolitical war that we're in, this Cold War we're in, those innovations in technology that's going to allow us to stay ahead of our adversaries, fuel victory in regional conflicts like this, but also help fend off other attacks against us from Russia and China and so on and so forth, is that investment in early stage technologies. It's that investment in the startup community, because that's where the innovation's happening. It's not happening at Lockheed or Raytheon or DoD or DARPA or CIA. They're actively engaging the private sector. Someone like a Lockheed Martin or Lockheed Martin Ventures, Northrop Grumman or Raytheon, they're partnering with, they're cooperating, they're increasing their collaboration with the startup and the tech community and the private sector. So it's kind of like a whole of government, whole of society effort to do this. The impact that's going to have longer term on the economy when you're investing and allocating capital locally, and we see that in portfolio companies within our portfolio. We got companies that we invested in super early stage. There were 3 guys in a garage. These are companies that were started by veterans who understood a pain point inside the national security space and went out there and started companies. Well, when you invest in 3 guys in a garage and they productize the company, they're now working at a Regis Center and getting some government contracts. You continue to fuel that growth. That company now turns into a 200-person company, warehouse space, and they're producing widgets that we need for kind of the future of the 21st century. So those are high-paying domestic jobs that are going to have a real impact on GDP. They're going to have a real impact on growth. And if you're an early allocator investor, it could have a real impact on your bottom line. So you have win-win-win across the board. You're investing in a technology and a platform and an ecosystem that's going to enhance national security and defense. If you're doing it right, you're going to realize some obscene outsized returns as a capitalist, which we all are. And you're helping contribute to the greater good. You're creating jobs inside the United States. So this is as bleak as things kind of began when we began this brief. To me, there's a significant light at the end of the tunnel, and that is, I think, this growth of a very vibrant ecosystem that not only is going to fuel how we live our lives. It's not only going to fuel how we defend ourselves and enhance national security. It's going to reshape the way we live our lives. We're at a point right now where, and I think I've said this before, it's analogous to the late 1800s to kind of the 1930s. In that period, we fought 2 world wars. In 1890, you had no idea what the next 40 years were going to look like. You just knew that horse and buggy wasn't the future, and this oil-powered lamp wasn't the future. The disruptions that we saw happen, the combustible engine, flights, electricity, modern manufacturing, the rise of industrial centers, the Industrial Revolution, reshaped how we lived our lives. But also look at the tectonic shifts that those had on geopolitics, on the way the world was
communication and transport, right?
Yeah, I mean, in that period, you saw the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. You saw, and I'll say the marginalization of the British Empire, but you saw the British Empire being joined by the American kind of ascendants. You had 2 wars that we fought. You had all the conflict and the Balkanizations in Eastern Europe. So we're going through those same kind of changes. It took us 40 years to go through that. That was on technology based on 150 years ago. The pace and impact of technology on the 21st century, I don't think it's 40 years. I think it's 10, if not shorter. When you start talking about quantum AI computing, I mean, look at the processing power and what you can do with a modern phone compared to what you could do with your Razr phone from Motorola 15 years ago. The world is changing, and I think that pace of change is going to continue to grow. I think the need and application for some of these disruptions is going to be national security and defense, but there's a much greater application to it as well.
Hamlet, I would just say that, you know, the portfolio companies we were investing in for the last 2.5, 3 years, their information operations, their robotics, their drones, their ISR sensor platforms, Internet of Things types of activities. That's what's playing out in Ukraine. And if you read Unrestricted Warfare by the Chinese PLA, they want to push us up to the point we go kinetic, and they will, and they have been. And I think Ukraine is the first proxy war between the US and China. You know, Russia's a vassal state of China because that's their economic lifeline and their future trading partner. And so the alignment there is, I think, the first phase of more dominoes to fall in South America, in Africa, East Asia. And so as we look at this, the authoritarian regimes are going to be watching our playbook. And so you're going to see trade flows start to move away from the globalization. And Trump was the first one to, I think, really identify the fact that we've got to rewire the global economy so we stop being taken advantage of foolishly. And so I think that boat has sailed. I think you're going to see economic infrastructure get rewired. And what you need to know in these proxy wars is what you saw in Ukraine is the playbook for a low cost, non-kinetic environment. Cyberspace, drones is going to be the way adversaries choose to fight with us downrange. And so as it relates to the infrastructure spend, there's trillions of dollars that are going to have to get rerouted, but the defense spending is now a serious matter. Germany increased to 2%. You probably will see Italy and Spain start to get their NATO obligations in order. And so I think defense spending is going to increase over the next 5 years because the uncertainty and the inequality in the global economy is going to put a lot of pressure for different trading partners to reallocate infrastructure. When they do that, there's conflict, there's winners and losers, and that's going to create conflict in Syria and in Iran and Armenia, in Nepal. India and China are at war right now. Nobody talks about it for water rights. So I think we're about to see a series of we'll call smaller level regional kinetic activity, and the only way for us to not go full-fledged kinetic is to utilize the technologies we've been investing in IronGate, and that is what the Chinese, you know, they're the ones fighting in these new domains. We have to match them. Europe's finally waking up, and so there's going to be hyper growth in defense technologies, asymmetric opportunities because of the dominoes of these proxy wars that are going to be fought.
Yeah. Yep. There's two things I want to make sure we cover, if it's okay with you guys. Sure. One, just from a point of view, you know, people look at the U.S. in the context of who our leadership is, and they say, do the American people really believe this shit? And I'm just saying that in general, right? And so when people look from the outside in, just like we look from the outside into Russia, there's suggestion that the Russian people may think that Putin's gone around the bend, right? But what do you really think's going on there?
Hamlet, I'll jump in here because I spoke to someone late last night from St. Petersburg, and he's a real estate developer, and he got out, and I asked him that question, and he's a good friend. You can't live in Moscow and do business and push back against the regime without tremendous blowback. And so I think the people of Russia realize this is ridiculous. Don't get me wrong, they've got their loyalist crew around Putin, but what I would tell you is a majority of Russians aren't on board with this. And so the ones that are protesting, you know, we've got to give them props because it comes at great personal economic cost.
Yeah, super interesting. And then Hamlet, you were going to say?
That's the $1 million question, right? Right now is if you look at Putin, where is he? Is he within his faculties? Is this a madman? Is this Tony Montana at the end of Scarface? How is this horror show going to end? It's anybody's guess at this point. I just think when you're engaging your adversary, you don't shortchange them, and you don't sell them short until you have them thoroughly defeated. So for the people who are ridiculing Putin right now and saying, "Oh, he's defeated," blah blah blah. Look, I hope so, and I hope we're seeing a complete collapse of a failed strategy. But until this issue is fully resolved, you've got to give the person some credit in the sense of don't take your foot off the accelerator. Don't assume that this guy's crazy. Assume this is something that he's been thinking out, and you got to defend against it. You got to attack it until you defeat your adversary. I hope at the end of the day, as Ryan said, most of the Russian people probably aren't pro-Putin. Just like I think most of the people inside Iran don't like the mullahs. I think you have 1.3 billion people inside China who couldn't give a rip about the Communist Party and Xi. Good, let's get those guys out of the way and let's go back to integrating our society globally, where we're relying on each other, we're trading with each other, we're culturally integrated, and let's find different ways to resolve our issues so it's not economic warfare, cyber warfare, which leads to direct conflict and war. Let's avoid that. But in this case, I think with Russia, with Putin, with Xi and China, and with Iran and the mullahs and North Korea, you name your dictator. There's some bad actors there that I think through totalitarian control, they're in charge of their country, and I'm sure there's the evil, bizarro version of me inside Russia right now saying something, oh, those Americans, whatever. What's different about us is whether you like Biden or don't like Biden, or whether you like Trump or don't like Trump, or Obama or Bush or all of the above, didn't like whatever. We get a chance to make a change in leadership every 4 years. So if you like it, great. If you don't, buckle up, make a change in 4 years. Xi's not going anywhere. Yeah. I mean, Xi, if he gets the Party Congress vote in October, is going to be basically the emperor of China. Putin, I mean, he came to power in a very, very, very methodical way, did his little exit for 4 years, let the puppet Medvedev run the country for 4 years, and came back in and wrote into law that he can overstay his welcome in the Kremlin, and he's going to be in charge of Russia longer than any czar.
Hamlet, question for you: does Putin do this without some implicit backing from Xi? I can't believe that he would have gone forward.
My personal opinion, armchair quarterbacking this is a coordinated action. And Xi said, "Hey, we're going to do this. You're going to go first, Mikey." Just like you said, Arthur. Yeah. You go first. Let's see what kind of inbound you take, and I'll course correct. And I frankly think he probably fed to Putin's ego and let him do that. I mean, I've seen memes and jokes going around about how Putin has become I'll use clean language, but has basically become Xi's little puppet or vassal state in some aspect. Look, if I was Putin, I'd watch my back, because Xi, I think, benefits by having Putin do what he's doing right now. Xi also benefits once Putin is out of the way and Russia's fractured, because all the natural resources they want are to the north and to the east of Moscow. So it's going to be an interesting dynamic to play out here.
To quote Arthur's mother in Arthur the movie, "We are ruthless people," right? So I can't imagine that China they've had to have the thought of taking over Russia, because that's their resource, right?
Well, it's not taking over Russia; it's taking over the world. But not to start cueing the James Bond evil music here, but Xi and the Chinese Communist parties have said they want to be the superpower, not a superpower, the superpower. It's about time we pay attention to our adversaries. When they tell us they want to do something that's a threat to us, pay attention. Putin's been saying that he wants to execute this playbook for 20 years. We've ignored it. China is saying they want to be the superpower for years, and we've ignored it. The superpower does mean longer term becoming the reserve currency of the world. It does mean creating a trading bloc that counters the West and the US marginalizing us so they can control everything else. So everyone talks about, well, why would Xi side with Russia? And now that his trading partners are North Korea and Iran and Venezuela, who cares? No, that to me, that's short-sightedness. Look at what they're trying to do. Their Belt and Road Initiative is putting their tentacles throughout the Middle East, throughout Eastern Europe, throughout Africa, throughout Latin America. They're trying to control assets and resources and influence. They want to create their low Earth constellation of satellites that beam internet to the Earth. They want to have their 5G towers everywhere that beams internet to the masses. Well, guess what that allows them to do? It allows them to control the narrative. It allows them to control messaging. It allows them to control society. That is their goal. That is their long-term goal, I think. So I think it's at a certain point. And when I say they, I'm talking about the Communist Party of China. I'm not talking about the Chinese people. If we want to get rid of the Chinese Communist Party and get into a fair fight in terms of just macroeconomics and capitalism, let's see what society comes out and who wins. Great, I welcome that battle. I just don't want the totalitarian party in charge of China, of Iran, of Russia calling the shots. And I think that's what you're starting to see. That reversion to two power blocks, I think, is what you're starting to see. Ryan mentioned that earlier. It's liberalized Western democracies where the people are in charge versus totalitarian societies where a limited few are in charge. And there's a reason why technology is going to play a key part in this, because technology and the disruptions that we're going to see in technology, data analytics, AI, surveillance capitalism, they're going to allow control of the masses by the few, or they're going to allow the masses to be able to control their own destiny. And that's what we're seeing at play right now. Look at how China uses technology in terms of surveillance capitalism. That's a keynote of what's to come if they have their control. And look, I get their thought process. They want to control 1.5 billion people, 1.4 billion people. They're going to use technology to do that. Call me a westernized American. I come from the school of thought where you don't. You let the people control it.
Yeah, I think to answer Frank's question about does Z eventually grab Eastern Europe, Eastern Russia, I don't believe so. I think China likes vassal states. They don't want people inside the inner kingdom. They like to keep outsiders out and insiders in. So I think they prefer economic vassals.
So what do you think the move, aside from obviously investing in funds like yours and IronGate and that sort of thing, what's the move? And I'm not, I totally advocate people investing with IronGate because I'm a believer, but I just want to, in the context of, okay, what other moves do I make?
Yeah, I think it's investing locally, whether it's through a fund or through companies. I think it's investing in foundations and legislation that empowers data privacy, and it allows people to be the controller of their data and be very mindful of encroachment of big tech. And there's certain business model changes that I think are coming as well. And I think being mindful of what disruptive technologies mean and how are they going to control you versus free you, and having a real healthy dialogue and exchange with policy leaders around that, I think, is critical.
Yeah, I think, look, where we are now, before this all started with Russia, Ukraine, there was, we thought commodities were going to outperform domestic equities this year, and they are. And there's been a leadership change underneath the index between different sectors, from tech and growth into value. But what I would tell you is technology as an asset class is critical for us as a country to invest in. Innovation, and I'm not talking about just the next software or app. We need to bring in deep tech into the mainstream economy, create new segments of investing. Because if you look at where we are, we're in stagflation. We've got high inflation. The rates can't really go up. The central bank must be doing this on purpose to inflate our way out of the debt that we're in, because now Republicans and Democrats feel like they have an unlimited credit card. And so that will eventually catch up with us unless we inflate our way out. And so I think this is being done by design. And what I would tell you, in that environment, we're in a Japanese style recession, in the long-term low growth environment, because of the drag.
A dead 10 years?
Well, but here's the difference between us and Japan. The Japanese are great at technology and mimicking, similar to China. What we have is innovation hubs. And so what we need to do is surge capital into those innovation hubs to bring technology, dual use technology out and proliferate it into the economy and start utilizing, these tech incubators around the country. So if you're too small to have a corporate R&D arm, well, you better find one, because that's the future growth. And so my macroeconomic model is a VAR economic GDP growth model. And if you look at the Atlanta Fed, I'll just tell you where to go. They're the leaders in creating the U.S. economic GDP growth model. There's one variable in that model that you need to pay attention to. It's productivity growth. And frankly, the only way to get productivity growth going forward from here on out is new technology. And so the only way out of this debt trap that we're in is investing in technology as a country. And the economy that does it first will be the one to kind of leapfrog out of this kind of low growth environment that we're in. So the issue, the complication that we have is the rampant generational cyber, IP theft that's been going on by the Chinese. They're stealing our R&D and utilizing it. And so the question is, can we out innovate the rate of theft that's going on? So cyber defenses are up. People are getting more educated and not to click that or befriend that person. But what I would tell you is the critical need, if I can leave you with one thing, the way we get out of this is investing into deep tech and proliferating it to the economy. Otherwise, China will outcompete us in the economic warfare because they'll have more growth in the next 10 to 20 years.
Well, with the hope that it doesn't stay static, where do we land? Is it China, Japan, Russia, US, Europe? Where do we stand in all that right now?
In terms of tech innovation?
Yeah.
I handicap it. Yeah, I handicap it like a long distance marathon, where you got a bunch of people running to finish the race, and there's a pack that's now separated. And in that pack, I think you have us, you have key allies in NATO and the Five Eyes. You have Israel, you have South Korea, you have Japan, and obviously you have China. In areas of hypersonics, AI, autonomous, a lot of speculation on who's breaking out from that pack, but you're starting to see the breakout happen. So if you ever watch a long distance race on the Olympics, over time, people kind of swap leads for a little bit.
Yeah.
But at some point, somebody breaks out from the pack.
Sprints, yeah.
And once that breakout happens, the rest of the pack falls back to the main pack, or just stands alone, and that person books and wins the race.
Yeah.
We're at that point right now where us, and I think primarily China, are starting to leapfrog each other a little bit. And it's going to get to the point where one of us is going to begin separating. Where we need to be is we need to make sure we either stay with China or get ahead of China. My personal opinion is China is going to have their own systemic issues in the next 15, 25 years. Upwards of 30, 35% of their population is aging out. They're going to have some structural issues. What I want to do is I want to avoid us getting into any kind of real meaningful conflict with China, and then allow us to stay ahead of them through technology. And technology, I think, is what's going to enable us, is going to enable us to do that. Goes back to what I said earlier, the whole concept of mutual agreed destruction. I want our adversaries to take a look at us and realize that when it comes to quantum, hypersonics, AI, cybersecurity, both offensive and defensive, commercial space, our arsenal of democracy, the weapon systems and the moats that we have built around our economy are so insurmountable that I got to find a different way to engage you versus conflict. Because to quote Joshua, the little computer from War Games, it's just not worth fighting that game. It's just not worth playing that game. Let's find a different way to coexist and work with each other.
The arsenal of democracy. I'm going to quote you on that one. Nice.
World War II. That's a World
Yeah.
War stuff that needs to come back fast. And we, instead of selling, war bonds, we need innovation bonds. And so Al had a question about, do we foresee the ability of this administration and the kind of, we'll call the liberal globalist tech environment in Silicon Valley being able to address this? And listen, there are globalists amongst us. There's people who have been conflicted. We need to look at, where we put our capital. Are we going in with BlackRock and people like that who do a lot of business in China? And that's fine. But how does that reflect your values? People say ESG, and we like to say liberty, security, and values, LSV. And what I would tell you is that 5 years ago, when we started this journey, Silicon Valley was kind of asleep or actively choosing to side with globalist agendas. I think today there's people, as innovation gets funded outside of Silicon Valley, there are people today that realize we need to create tech cultures and tech entrepreneurship hubs so that we can have the technology innovation in the right hands. And
Yep.
there's a big problem in the venture capital world today. A lot of people are going to find that they may be an LP in a fund that might have Chinese PLA money in it or Russian money that's conflicted with oligarchs. And a lot of these startups don't spend the time, either they don't know how to do it or don't care to figure out who's on the cap table. And that's going to become a big issue as you see these types of decoupling of economic spheres. Who are you LPs with and what fund? And what kind of China exposure or Russia exposure do you have from an LP base? And that's something that we pay a lot of attention to, as you can imagine, because some of the people we do business with appreciate that we have that kind of counterintelligence as top of mind.
Yeah. Well, I'll quote a good friend of mine that was just over here the other night. We started talking about this, and the narrative around how the oligarchs are being treated and suffering or whatever it is. He said, I don't care about them. Right? What do we care about the oligarchs, right? They're going to be fine.
Yeah.
The relevance, I just think that people think that these folks that made all their money because of Putin, and I'm making all kinds of assumptions here. I don't know what I'm talking about, but let's just say that's true. If Putin said you're going to have to suffer for a while, they have no recourse, right? So what? Yeah.
Well, let me tell you, there's foreign investors who own local ruble denominated government debt. And they made a debt payment in, I think, March 7th. It was like 120 million or something. And Putin told the banks, do not pay, you can pay Russian citizens, do not pay the dividend or the interest payment to the foreign bondholders. And so that money is just being recycled in the economy. And so the big question is, does that denominate a default? Does that define as a default or not? It's unclear. But what I would tell you is when you own local debt, there is no CDS on it for the most part. And secondly, there's no way to go get recourse because they write the rules. And so,
yeah, the rule of law doesn't exist in any way except for theirs, right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, Hamlet, before we run off, I just want to, because I didn't know what this was. What's Section 5 of NATO?
That's an attack on us is an attack on all. So if you attack one country kinetically, you're going to war. So what basically NATO said is if you attack one of us from a cyber standpoint, we may consider that as a attack on all and look for retaliation.
Yeah. Cool. All right.
So,
Any last questions? Write them in. You want to wrap up? Either or both of you?
Yeah. Ryan, you want to say something and I'll cap it? You're on mute.
IronGateGlobal.com is where you can find us. We're very active in the space. We're very focused on investing in technologies that are going to make a difference for the warfighter. And it's a hot space no matter if a Republican or a Democrat administration comes in, because these are the asymmetric segments, domains of warfare that will be very prominent in the next 10 to 20 years.
Yeah.
Great.
And I just to double tap that statement right there. I have my own personal politics that I don't mind getting into in a private setting. This is something that I think that whether you're left or right of center, this is something that I think we can and we should and we must come together on politically and as a country, which is investing domestically, investing at home, creating jobs at home, creating technologies that make an impact, that hire more people, that lift the economic stability and vitality of this country. There's no room for politics in that. It's not a left or right issue. It's America issue. It's investing in national security and defense. I think it's critical. I think it's going to help reshape the world. As shameless capitalists, there's an opportunity for people to make a lot of money along the way, but you're creating jobs, you're creating industries, you're creating sectors. Think about the trillions of dollars that came off of this little thing that Steve Jobs came out with. What you're seeing is multiple sectors and asset classes being created around tech. So it's important to get involved. It's important to get engaged. We want to be thought leaders in this space. Arthur, I want to thank you sincerely for this. We look forward to doing this again and just kind of talking about updates in terms of how this landscape is evolving. Again, I see this as a beginning of a much choppier near-term future with tremendous upside potential in front of us that I think we can navigate thoroughly. I love my government. I just think it can be incredibly inefficient at times, and it needs private sector solution and capital to get involved.
Great. I just want to add an anecdote, and it's really difficult to operate in your life and know all these people are suffering in Ukraine. And so I was sitting in yoga class the other day, and the yoga instructor said something very insightful. Said, yes, there's sorrow, there's people suffering, but all the suffering that you do on their behalf is not going to help the situation. Right. So just do what you can to help, and don't use up your energy, bandwidth, and time wasting your time worrying about it. Just do something about it if you can, but don't huddle up in a corner and sob away, because it does no good.
Arthur, there's one nonprofit that I highly recommend if people are sitting here and saying, hey, I'd love to do something. PlainUkraine.com, where you can buy non-lethal goods for the Ukrainian military. Check it out. You can go on Amazon. They're updating it live, what they need, supplies. You can go put $100 in, $10 in, but it's going to go to a warehouse. And the first set of planes have gone from North America over to Poland to resupply critical supplies that the Ministry of Defense needs. And so there's ways to help. And like you said, not just stew on it.
Yeah. Yep. Super helpful. Well, thanks again, guys. Really, really appreciate it. And Hamlet, Ryan, really, really helpful. I'm going to publish this, if it's okay, the recording, and then send it off to everybody. And meanwhile, as I usually say, thank you all for spending your time, spending the only thing that you can't make more of, and that's your time. Till next time. Thank you.
Thank you, Arthur. Bye now.
Bye-bye.